You've spent most of your life feeling like you don't quite belong to any group, not old enough to be called Gen X, not young enough to be called a millennial. And nobody, not a single researcher, journalist, or pop culture label, has ever had a proper name for what you are. But there is a reason you feel that way, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you being broken. If you were born anywhere between 1977 and 1985, you grew up inside one of the most psychologically unique windows in modern human history. You were the last generation to experience a completely analog childhood and the very first generation to be thrown headfirst into a digital world as adults. You remember a time before the internet changed everything. And you also remember the exact week, the exact moment when it did. Researchers and sociologists sometimes call you the Oregon Trail generation, a forgotten microgeneration that slipped through the cracks between two massive cultural identities. That feeling of being unnamed, unclassified, and perpetually caught between two worlds has quietly shaped your psychology in ways most people never pause to examine. This video is for you, and it is long overdue. Psychologists who specialize in generational identity call your cohort Zennials, a bridge generation that straddles the divide between Gen X skepticism and millennial optimism. But, unlike every other generation, yours arrived without a cultural instruction manual. Gen X was handed a clear identity: be cynical, be independent, trust institutions as little as possible. Millennials were handed an equally clear message: you are special. You are seen, and the future belongs to you. You were handed ... silence. And so you spent decades quietly absorbing both messages simultaneously, and then spending enormous mental energy trying to reconcile them inside yourself. Think back to your childhood in the early 1980s. You played outside until the streetlights came on, and no one tracked your location, called your cell phone, or filed a missing persons report. You had a handful of television channels, a VCR if you were lucky, and maybe a Nintendo Entertainment System that required blowing into the cartridge to make it work. Boredom was not a crisis that needed to be solved. It was simply Tuesday afternoon. You learned to sit with silence, to manufacture your own entertainment, and to exist without a constant stream of external stimulation. That experience, unglamorous, unstructured, and largely forgotten, gave you something that neither Gen X nor millennials fully developed: a deep, bone-level adaptability born from genuine self-reliance. And then something happened. Somewhere around the mid to late 1990s, as you were stepping into early adulthood, the internet did not politely knock on the door. It kicked it down, not as a gentle suggestion, but as a full cultural earthquake that rewrote every rule you had been quietly learning to follow. AOL Instant Messenger replaced handwritten notes. Napster dissolved the music industry overnight. Google made the library feel obsolete. And all of this happened before most of you turned 25. The crucial difference between you and every generation that came after you is this: you had to make a conscious, deliberate choice to embrace the digital world. That decision, that single act of conscious adaptation, while standing at a cultural crossroads, created a psychological split that lives inside you to this very day. Part of you will always be analog. Part of you is now completely fluent in digital space, so fluent that younger people sometimes mistake you for one of them. And because you carry both fluencies simultaneously, you sometimes feel like a translator standing at the border between two civilizations that cannot understand each other. Then came September 11th, 2001. You were between 16 and 24 years old, exactly inside the developmental window that psychologists call the impressionable years, the critical period when major events carve themselves permanently into your worldview. This is the age when your foundational beliefs about safety, authority, and the future are not yet fully hardened, which means what happens to you here leaves the deepest marks for your generation. The defining event of that impressionable window was watching the entire concept of a safe world collapse in a single morning. Security that you had quietly assumed as a background fact of life, evaporated. You didn't grow up expecting catastrophe, but you became the generation that learned, very young, to carry it as a permanent background hum. And then, just as you were finally finding your footing in your late 20s and early 30s, the 2008 financial crisis arrived. Many of you had done precisely what you were told: finish college, build a career, perhaps start a family, maybe buy a house. You had played by all the rules, and then the floor silently disappeared beneath you. Careers evaporated, housing values collapsed, retirement savings were gutted, and a decade of careful adult construction dissolved in less than 12 months. Economic research on this specific cohort consistently shows an elevated, persistent baseline of financial anxiety, not because this generation is irresponsible, but because of timing. You were struck by the two largest systemic shocks of the 21st century at the precise worst developmental moments, once while forming your identity, and once while building your adult foundation. Is it any wonder that you sometimes feel permanently braced, quietly tensed, waiting for the next collapse that common sense tells you is probably coming? That is not pessimism, it is learned hypervigilance, and every piece of psychological research says it was a completely rational response to what actually happened. But here is what the same research also consistently shows. You are one of the most cognitively and emotionally resilient cohorts alive on this planet right now. Not because you were protected, but precisely because you were not. You adapted to paradigm shifts, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, each time under real pressure, with real consequences. You learned to code switch between analog and digital, between optimism and deep skepticism, between institutional trust and total self-reliance. You became fluent in multiple psychological languages, and that fluency, even when it feels like confusion, is actually an extraordinary and rare form of human capacity. Imagine a woman, let's call her Sarah, born in 1981, sitting in a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning, slowly scrolling through her phone. She's looking at her Instagram feed, but something about it feels hollow, like eating food that has no taste. She finds herself remembering, without meaning to, writing long handwritten letters to her best friend who moved to another city in 6th grade. She can still feel the physical weight of the paper under her pen, the specific smell of a sealed envelope, the slow and aching anticipation of waiting 10 days for a reply. No push notification has ever, not once, replicated that feeling. But she also knows with complete clarity that she could not survive a single week without her phone, and that contradiction drains her in a way she has never found the right words to explain. Now imagine a man, call him Marcus, born in 1979, standing in the parking lot of his old high school at his 25th reunion. He looks around at the people he grew up with and notices they all seem settled in a way he cannot quite locate in himself. On paper, he has every marker of a functioning adult, a stable career, a family he loves, a mortgage he is slowly paying down. Yet there is a persistent, low-grade feeling inside him, a sense of waiting for life to actually begin, even though the evidence all around him says it already has. Some psychologists would reach for the term arrested development to describe this, but for your generation, this is not a pathology. It is the completely predictable psychological consequence of having your developmental runway disrupted, rerouted, and reconstructed not once, but multiple times before you were 35. Now, think for a moment about the music you grew up with. You had Nirvana and Michael Jackson in the same cultural decade, two artists who could not be further apart in meaning, and you loved both of them without contradiction. You made mixtapes on cassette and also built MP3 playlists on early Winamp before music streaming existed. You watched Saturday morning cartoons in your pajamas and also witnessed the birth of Netflix. You saw both the last rotary phone in a relative's house and the first iPhone announcement in the same lifetime. Your cultural identity is not confused, it is genuinely, organically plural, in a way that no generation before or after you can honestly claim. You contain multitudes, and the psychological frameworks built by researchers were simply not designed with your specific complexity in mind. Here is something that almost no one has ever said to your face directly. Your generation carries one of the highest documented rates of what developmental psychologists call identity diffusion anxiety. Not because you are emotionally fragile, but because you were never given coherent cultural permission to simply be one thing. You watched Gen X publicly, proudly claim its rebellion and its distrust as a defining badge. You watched millennials publicly, loudly claim their optimism and their collective identity as a generation with a clear story, and you stood quietly at the border between those two worlds, belonging to both, fully claimed by neither. That border is a lonely place to stand for 40 years. But here is what modern developmental psychology, slowly, carefully, is beginning to understand about the people who grew up exactly where you did. The individuals who were formed inside genuine, unscripted uncertainty, not manufactured adversity, but real, structural, systemic instability, consistently develop a form of cognitive flexibility that simply cannot be taught, replicated, or fast-tracked in more stable childhoods. You are comfortable, genuinely comfortable, sitting with contradictory ideas at the same time, without needing to resolve them. You can carry deep, aching nostalgia for a world that no longer exists, while simultaneously building something new with real competence. You can distrust a system entirely, intellectually, and still choose to participate in it strategically, because you understand nuance at a level that pure cynics and pure optimists simply do not. You can grieve the analog world you lost before you were ready to lose it, and still be one of the most effective people in any digital room you walk into. This psychological duality, this permanent, low-grade internal tension, is not a flaw in your character or a wound that needs healing. It is a feature. The ancient Greeks had a word for this precise condition: metaxy, the charged, alive, often uncomfortable space of the in-between, where the most profound human experiences and the most original human thinking always emerge. You have not merely visited metaxy, you have lived there permanently since adolescence. The discomfort you carry, that quiet, persistent sense of not quite fitting, not quite landing, not quite arriving, was never evidence that something in you was wrong. It was evidence that you were built for complexity. In a cultural moment that consistently rewarded simple, clean, categorical answers, most people spend their entire lives desperately seeking one clear tribe, one clear label, one clear story they can tell about themselves at a dinner party. You learned slowly, painfully, without anyone telling you. This was the lesson, that you don't have that luxury, and you never did. If you have spent years, quietly, privately, wondering why you feel just slightly out of phase with the world moving around you, why nothing quite clicks the way it seems to for other people, now you know. You are not too sensitive, and you are not too cynical, and you are not too nostalgic, and you are not too anything. You are the precise, unrepeatable, psychological product of a specific, extraordinary, and deeply demanding window in human history, and every contradictory thing you feel is encoded in that history. The world shifted beneath your feet more than once, more violently than anyone warned you it would, and more permanently than anyone ever stopped to acknowledge, and you kept going. That is not something to explain away, or apologize for, or quietly carry in the background of your chest anymore. That is something to finally, fully understand and carry forward with everything it deserves. Pride.